Welcome to part one of this module on our lecture on the social forces that have shaped California. So in the first part, which is this part, we're going to talk about the California Gold Rush and the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then in the next part, we're going to talk about the Great Depression and migration into the region. And then finally, we're going to talk about Japanese internment that happened during World War II. And so the picture you're seeing here is something called a racial dot map. You can actually Google it and see it for the entire country. Basically, we're going to talk about some of the immigration that shaped what California looks like today. And some themes that are going to be recurring throughout this entire module that I want you to think about. First one is migration. What caused migration to California? Who was migrating to California, and how did that affect the people who were already here? Economic competition and racism. And so we're going to look at the intersection a lot between economic competition or competition for resources and how they intersect with racism and how different groups of people were discriminated against due to that. I just want to start off by talking, I'm not even going to really talk about it, but just mentioning that what we are moving on to now is post the Mexican-American War. So the Mexican-American War occurred from 1846 to 1848, and this followed after the U.S. annexed Texas, which was the beginning of the war. And then after the war, after the U.S. Had defeated the Mexican forces, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo basically gave the U.S. in that part of the map that you see there marked Mexican secession, all of California basically. There's a little bit to the south there that was later purchased in 1853, but Mexico lost about half of its land due to this treaty, and so what we're talking about now, California is now part of the United States. And so we're going to talk about the gold rush, which if you've heard of the San Francisco 49ers, which I'm guessing you have, that's where the term 49ers comes from. But it began in 1849. In 1849, before the gold rush, there were about 26,000 people that were either Europeans, Americans, or Mexican Americans living in California. The gold rush caused 100,000 more to arrive in the next year, which is an incredible amount of people to arrive. The tales of easy to get gold were widely spread in the middle and eastern United States, and massive droves of people came in to strike it rich. And this meant that native populations were starting to be significantly outnumbered. Remember, we talked about in the previous populations how native populations had been decimated, and now we have large amounts of Americans coming into California. And so there's this kind of image that is used for the 49er, that he's often a single, rugged loner, hard-working man working with his hands. In actuality, many people who came were actually middle or even upper class New Englanders who were wealthy and well educated, and they could afford to come. Some also came from other parts of the U.S. as well, but a decent portion came from New England. The cost of getting to California was really high. At the time, it was really difficult to get to California, so only if you had wealth could you even afford to kind of take advantage of this gold rush and try to get there to make your money. And these men generally had no experience with hard labor. And we're going to learn that they thought it was going to be very easy to mine and get gold, but what they found was quite different. They primarily got there two ways. Most of them arrived by boat. A very long boat ride, which is pretty expensive. Some did come from the Midwest across the Oregon Trail. If you were of my age, many of you probably have no idea why this Oregon Trail graphic is up there, but the Oregon Trail was a game that you would play in elementary school where you would have to like make decisions about how much you bought and what you were crossing, and then you would like lose resources, and you had to try to get all the way to the West Coast without everybody in your camp dying, which was particularly hard. So some did cross over land, but again, that was the harder path to take, but still also pretty expensive, and a slow going way to get there in 1849. This influx of people kind of led to this like cosmopolitan space of a diverse group of people living together. Especially this picture is from San Francisco. So despite the fact that 49ers are often pictured as just white men, there were actually multiple immigration streams coming in from Mexico, England, France, Spain, Chile, Peru, and China. They were about 90% male. Many of them were married with children, possibly somewhere else. And the idea was that they were going to come in and they were going to make their money and then return home in order to provide for their families. This fact that there was 90% men who came into an area led to a lot of intermarriage between these men and people who were already living there, including Native Americans. But generally speaking, it was the beginning of that kind of space of California as this very mixed cosmopolitan space. And so again, this idea of the gold rush was that basically you could just show up on the West Coast and there's just huge pieces of gold just lying on the ground that you don't even really have to mine. Incredibly easy. You're definitely going to make a fortune. And again, that's not what they found when they got here. So I want you to think about that kind of economic competition that is going to happen. So gold was advertised as being plentiful and easy to procure. And when they were coming to California, many of these men formed these mining cooperatives before they came. And they were like this socialistic brotherhood. So they had rules of conduct and they were all going to share resources. Some of them were funded by other companies. So they had, shareholders or stockholders in order to provide for. And in a manner of speaking, this was kind of like a pushback against the industrialization that had just happened in the East Coast, right? This idea of like going west and living in these kind of utopian societies out in, the wilderness, striking out on your own, as opposed to living in these kind of cramped city spaces. And initially, there was less racial tension, right? So initially, particularly the white men who came weren't very concerned about Chinese who were there. They were seen as enough resource for everybody. They would work together in order to procure this gold. And so your chapter talks about a blend of revulsion, attraction, stereotype, and romanticism about Mexicans and Chinese, right? So definitely racism happening, but not this, sense of we are competing for the same resource. And Native Americans at this time were also kind of romanticized and viewed as noble savages, these vanishing Americans, less competition for their land. The people who were coming out there weren't necessarily at that moment coming out to take land from Native Americans. But that's going to change because in reality, gold was really difficult to procure. It was really, really hard work. Most, again, had no experience with hard labor. So they did not find this setting where they got to come out and just pick gold up off the ground. It was a lot of work to sift through other stuff to find gold. There wasn't nearly as much gold as they thought. It was hard to just break even. The amount of gold that you could find in any given day barely covered your expenses. And so non-whites are now seen as a competition to this resource. And so there starts to be a lot of hostility towards other groups. And this is also by the mid 1850s, in a very short amount of time, the gold that was there was mostly exhausted. So a lot of people had kind of, paid all this money to get out there. Their mining companies broke apart, and there was a lot of blame against Chinese and Mexican and Native Americans of their failure. And so we see during that time a lot of discrimination against Chinese miners. So in California passed the California Foreign Miners Tax, which was essentially a tax of $20 a month for anyone who was not American in order to mine, which is an incredible amount of money at that time. And remember, people are having a hard time just breaking even while doing this mining, so an additional $20 a month is a lot of money. And there was essentially no enforcement of this tax. And what I mean by that is there was no structured legal process where somebody would come in and they would get their permit and they would say, okay, now I've paid my money and now I'm going to go on. So essentially that tax could be effectively levied by any white man. Could go up to a Chinese miner and say, okay, well, you need to pay your taxes to be here now. And so trying to outcompete them for that resource. And this also led to a competition of land with Native Americans. There were several atrocities committed, one including the Clear Lake or Bloody Island Massacre, where many Native Americans were slaughtered of the Pomo tribe, simply over this competition of resources and space happening in the region. And so I want to talk a little bit more about immigration from China and kind of go through how Chinese immigrants were kind of systematically discriminated against during this time. Which was a shift because in 1848, the U.S. began to formally encourage immigration from China. They needed labor to do things like build the railroad, and they needed cheap labor, and they could get that from China. So initially, the Chinese were welcomed, right? We needed this cheap labor to come in. But by the 1870s, the Chinese comprised about 10% of California's population, so a pretty significant portion. And then in 1870, there's an economic recession. And if there is a theme that is repeated over and over again, history loves to repeat itself, that whenever there is an economic downturn, people like to point to minority and immigrant populations and say, this is your fault, you're taking our stuff. And that's exactly what happened in 1870. So you get the rise of political parties like the Working Man's Party of California, which was led by an Irishman named Dennis Keary, who ran on a platform pretty successfully of getting Chinese out of California completely. And so you get something called the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed. So originally, people not only wanted to prevent any more immigration from China, but they also wanted to force them out of the state. But they couldn't do that because the neighboring states protested. They didn't want an influx of Chinese coming into their states. So we get this. This is a national act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed by pressure from Western states. It was passed in 1882, and this is the first law implemented in the United States to prohibit the influx of a specific ethnic group. Other immigration of other people this time was unlimited. So this is a specific act just targeting Chinese people who are seen as, again, outcompeting for those resources in California. And so not only could people not immigrate from China, Chinese Americans who were already living here could not become naturalized citizens. And what it means to become a naturalized citizen is if you move here from another country, there's a process by which you can go through to become an American citizen. And the Chinese were forbidden from that process. So Chinese who were already here, who were not American citizens, had no option to become a citizen. And no new Chinese were allowed to come into the country. And part of the rationale behind this is that the Chinese were seen as so foreign that they were incapable of assimilating into becoming kind of proper American citizens. And we see this theme before when we talked about in Module 1 how the Spanish were upset that Native Americans weren't becoming proper colonial citizens. So one of the excuses that was used to justify this act was that we need to prevent the influx of Chinese because they really cannot assimilate into American society. We should note that this act was renewed by a couple of other acts, but it was not fully overturned really until World War II. So it was in place for quite some time. And in World War II, China became our ally against Japan, and we're going to talk about in the third part of this lecture that period and discrimination against Japanese. But it's not until World War II when China becomes our ally that we say, okay, in order to kind of make good with our ally, we're going to end the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so your chapter in your book talks about Wong Kim Ark. He was an American citizen that was born in San Francisco, and he traveled to China. And when he came back in, he was refused entry back into the United States. He had traveled to China before, re-entered the U.S. with no problem, but this time he had gone back after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and when he came back, they would not let him into the country. And it's important to note that travel between the U.S. and China was pretty common at this time. There was tons of trade going on, and it was very common for Chinese American citizens to have ties back into their country, so go visit family and come back. But he was prohibited from entering the country when he came back in, and he was detained on the ship that he came in on, most likely, while his case went to the Supreme Court. Later on, there were detention centers that were set up in San Francisco to hold people while they were processed, and when they were detained, when they wouldn't be let into the country, but these hadn't been built yet at this time. But his case went all the way to Supreme Court. The argument against him was that he could not be a real citizen of the United States since his parents, who were not citizens, could not become citizens. And so that was the argument against him in court. And again, he had to appeal it many times all the way to the Supreme Court, all while being imprisoned on this boat. And so the idea is, since his parents can't become citizens, then he can't become a true citizen because his allegiance will always be to his parents, and then therefore his allegiance will always be to China. And so it's this catch-22 for Chinese Americans, right? There's no way for them to become full-fledged Americans. He won his court case and was allowed back in the U.S. Later on, he chose to go back and live in China. But even though he won this court case, because according to the 14th Amendment, yes, he is a U.S. citizen and he gets to come back into the country, extreme discrimination against Chinese remained, especially when they were trying to enter the country. So they had to prove their citizenship in multiple ways when returning, which was difficult. They had to either provide a birth certificate, which was difficult, as many Chinese Americans were born at home. In San Francisco, many records were burned during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and the subsequent fire that burned the city. So a lot of people lost their records. They also had to take tests for Americanness. So not just how well do you speak English, but obscure questions about their hometown and things like, how to get from point A to point B in their hometown. The English was also a difficult test because Chinese Americans tend to live in Chinese enclaves at this time. So there was a chance that you weren't readily learning or having access to a lot of English, especially if you were a young person. And by 1892, you had to have 2 white non-Chinese witnesses to verify your citizenship, which is difficult due to these ethnic enclaves, right? To necessarily find 2 white non-Chinese witnesses to verify that you're a citizen. So Chinese Americans who were here were very afraid to leave the country, that they wouldn't be let back in, and lots were not let back in. During this time, you see the formation of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, which is still functioning today, which was very active in trying to secure the rights for Chinese Americans. And again, they're still very active today. But we see this growing discrimination against Chinese, especially after the gold rush and after that recession of 1870, where the Chinese are, while initially welcomed, are now seen as competing for resources. And there were some other subsequent legislations that also discriminated against the Chinese and other Asian populations, such as the 1922 Cable Act, which basically revoked citizenship of women who married non-citizens. And this was really targeted at Chinese women, who was not that uncommon for them to marry a man who might not be an American citizen but had immigrated from China at some point. And so if she married somebody who was not a citizen, then she would automatically have to give up her citizenship. And again, this was not targeted to other groups, and it certainly wasn't targeted towards men. Men could marry whoever they wanted. And then again, the Immigration Act of 1924, which limited immigration from different countries to certain percentages of populations that were already here, and it really favored Northern and Western European countries, and really worked against Asian and Eastern European countries. People that were seen as less desirable to come into the United States. So now you're going to move on to your next chapter and to the next part of lecture.